Well, sexual abuse is not easy to talk about, regardless of gender. But for men in particular, the road to healing can be fraught with obstacles. My guest today, Sean Wheeler, knows all about that. He never spoke of his own abuse until decades after it happened. Sean, thank you so much for coming on and for your courage and telling your story on national television.
Yeah, well, thank you. It's an amazing blessing and journey to have been here. And I heard that you all talked about in the intro about, it does happen a lot. It happens to boys and girls. And now when I speak, I tell people, look, I went through 4 years of that. And I got beaten and I got used in child pornography and I got all kinds of things that happened to me, but that is not the end of my story. And if it happened to you or somebody you know, that's not the end of yours either, or theirs.
I know that. I personally walk with people through their healing, and I know that it can change, but sometimes when you're in that place, you've never told anyone, it's so scary, and you didn't tell anyone for decades. Why keep it a secret?
I was believing lies of the enemy. I was afraid if the world knew what had happened to me, if people knew that they wouldn't want me around, that I was somehow corrupted by things. And even worse, because it happened so young, I believed it was my fault, which is a common thing among
So common.
And it's really not. As my counselor told me, a child can never consent, they can only comply.
And I think for anyone who's a victim of any kind of abuse, these are things that were done to you. Sometimes people freeze up, they don't know how to respond, or there's a threat, or there's a sick kind of love. Like there's a lot of things that, but it's done to you. And I think that's the very first thing that abuse victims have to get over is that lie. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that, but it was men in your community. So tell me a little bit about what happened to you, just a little bit.
Well, I got initially, when somewhere around age 5, lured into what we would call a shed or a detached garage, or a back garden type thing. And above it had a loft, and I got taken in there by an older guy who was probably, at the time he seemed ancient to me, but he was probably all of 19. And he was very nice, getting me to go in, and ended up getting me up to the upper part and then proceeding with molesting me, which in itself is a word. Took my counselor 6 months to get me to say that word.
Wow.
I'd call it the M word because Allison said, why? And I said, I don't want to say that word. It's a label.
Yeah.
And it hurts to say it. And she said, we've got to get you to the point because you're holding on to some sort of sense of guilt because of that word. So I learned to say that. And then he introduced me to a greater circle. And trafficking happens in many different ways. I can tell you, I remember somewhere around 7 different individuals who were frequently get me over that period of 4 years. And it all started with that one who was able to get me away from the public view. And I only remember the one time with him alone. And then after that, it was always 2 to 4 at one time. And they would hit me and use me in the pornography at one point when I was 7, which in itself is an amazing thing because God restored my image. He said, I'm giving you back your picture.
Yeah, even for you to be here today on camera is a sign of your healing because that would have triggered you in the past to be on camera.
Yeah, and I'm perfectly comfortable. Talk about the peace of without understanding because I'm sitting here looking at you outside of my own country, outside of my own home, outside of my own comfort zone, and yet I'm perfectly comfortable because God is with us everywhere we go. He's restored my picture, and He's restored my voice, and He says, you take that hope and you share it, and that's what I get to do.
You're doing this literally to help other people. You're even, coming here again, you can hear those little voices like, don't go on camera, and you fight those voices because you want your story to help other people.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
And I do. And the last time I was in Canada, I was 11, and it was an amazing trip. It actually began a healing process with my own father, and it was a fishing trip, and I got lost in the woods and rescued by a Mountie, and yeah. So to this day, your RCMPs are huge heroes in my book, and they always will be.
Oh, I love that. That's so beautiful. Well, just before we wrap up this first part of the interview, Your relationship with God, he had a role even in those early days. You cried out to him. Tell me a little bit about that moment when you were 9.
Yeah, the last time it happened that I recall, I was back at my house. I was hiding in a closet and I was crying, and I remember saying, "Father, help me." And instantly I had this sense I couldn't even cry anymore. It's like, he took away the tears and he took away the hurt in that moment. And it would be years before I was finally sort of brought out of that process. But in that moment, that hurt stopped instantly. And for years, I figured that's where the story ended, in the blessing, as if that wasn't enough of a blessing. But I put the pieces together a couple of years ago, 2 weeks after I said that prayer. We moved away from that town, and they never got me again.
The abuse ended.
And that is an encounter with the Spirit. That's why I cry at moments like this, because, man, if that wasn't the hand of God at work in the life of a 9-year-old, I don't know what was.
That's the God we serve, man. He is a protector of the innocent, and he rushes to our help when we cry out to him.
Yeah.
There is more to your story. We are going to dig into that. You know, I've always been a big believer that pursuing healing is not just a gift we give ourselves, but also everyone around us. Sean is such a great example of that. In just a moment, we're going to talk about how his healing has impacted others. You're not going to believe this, particularly men get convicted of sexually abusing little boys. That's next.